Hi, this is Paul, and I've got a special guest with me on today. Now, I'm not always sure I say your last name correctly. Paul
Uh,
Antleitner.
Pretty close. Paul Ann Lightner. Ann Lightner.
Ann Lightner.
Yeah. So think of a lady's name: Ann, light in the middle, and ner at the end. Ann
Ann
Lightner.
Lightner.
Yeah, it's an old German name that my uncle did some digging in, and he's actually a bit of an agnostic. So, but he just was really interested in our family of origin and what it means, and evidently means light giver. So
Ooh,
I'll
that's
claim
nice.
that last name and try to live into that.
Well, that's wonderful. Now, Paul has his own podcast, and how often do your episodes come out?
Weekly, and it's usually front side of the week.
Okay.
Like you, I'm in pastoral ministry full time, so I try to get that between a Monday and a Wednesday, and it's close to weekly. There are some times, where it's not, but I've pushed myself to do that because I know that even if I take a week off, I lose the opportunity for engagement with people, and then it just kind of falls out of their purview. So yeah, it's weekly, and I think we have a lot of overlapping interests. And yours is one of the few podcasts that I will listen or try to listen into regularly. So I think we both share this sort of background in what was once called Christian thought. That's not really a popular term anymore. In
Hmm.
fact, that's actually what I have my master's in, although for most people I just call it like philosophical theology because they go Christian thought. What's that? So, similar shared interests in, theology of culture, the intersection of theology with philosophy. You talk about guys like James K. Smith and Charles Taylor, C.S. Lewis, Kierkegaard. That's my wheelhouse too, and I love talking with people about that sort of stuff. So,
Well,
similar to you, it's also I usually the episodes vary between conversations I'll have with guests and I guess maybe more lectures. I don't know if you call what you do lecturing, but the monologue stuff as well. So I'll do some more extended series where I might kind of do a 3 or 4 part series on theology and science or theology and culture, and then try to just sprinkle in as many guests with the hope. Like, I think you do a really good job of this, and I really loved the conversation you just recently had with Vervaeke, where you guys are clearly coming from some different points of view. But one of the things I so appreciate, and I think we need more of, and it's something I'm trying to do too, is have foster nuanced, charitable conversation with people. As soon as we get our defenses up, as soon as we feel threatened, our amygdala hijacks our brain. It
yeah.
shunts down that prefrontal cortex, and now we can't even exchange information. We can't exchange ideas at all, and there's no room for cognitive spiritual development when that happens. So you're modeling it, and I really can't tolerate in this day and age where it seems like everything that gets clicks is outrage based.
Yeah.
I just can't consume that stuff. It hurts my own soul. I see it leak out of me into how I interact with other people. And I go, what? Why am I talking like this? Well, it's so, you know, years ago, I shut off the cable news, the talk shows. And so I find the stuff that you're doing, Paul, to be of a balm to the soul and a intellectual pushing too, as well. So,
Well, thank you. Thank you. We did a conversation a few months ago, and that
yeah,
was sort of for your podcast.
yeah.
And you interviewed me, and we talked about Jordan Peterson stuff and some of that. So I wanted to interview you and dig into a little bit more of your story and your background. That's one of the things that, I sort of just bumbled into what I'm doing in many ways. But one of the things that I have most appreciated about what's come out of what I've been bumbling into has been the sharing of the stories and a sense of people knowing each other, and then creating spaces where people can meet and connect and have some of that fruitful dialogue that's productive and I think
Well, you're
I
doing
think
that.
we needed.
You're doing that. I mean, I've hopped on a few times, even that Discord server that you opened up, and I'm just amazed at like these people. And you've even, I love the whoever came up with the idea of having, people put pins on a Google map for where they're located. And I look at that map and I go, this is really incredible. It's really cool. And I know part of your story is, a bit of the miraculous providence of God maybe on this whole thing, as
Yeah.
someone who's pastoring a smaller church, and just, you struggle to figure out how to get butts and seats at all, and then all of a sudden this thing's happening, and you got people, I think I logged in one time, hopping into bed, and now I was reading all these wonderfully profitable discussions that are happening at 11 p.m. among total strangers, and it's so immensely encouraging, because a little bit of my story, and I can fill you in on maybe more of the details, but at least one part of it I want to highlight now is when I was going through my master's in essentially philosophical theology. My goal was, I'm going to go straight from this into my PhD. And I was talking to professors, advisors about that. And so many of these professors in theological academia were saying, don't do it, man. Like, the whole system is collapsing, this way of people, making six figures to teach people theology. And now they're turning so many seminaries, divinity schools are in financial disarray. People just aren't going to school for this, even at an undergrad level. There's so much pressure for people to do STEM stuff. And I love STEM. It's wonderful. But so many people feel this pressure that, and maybe rightfully so, that they should do something in undergrad that will help them get a job. It's a novel idea. But so he said, hey, many of these advisors I was talking to were saying, just, unless you absolutely have to, you feel like you would die without getting a PhD, I would not advise you to do that. But what several of them told me was, that doesn't mean the questions people have are going away just because they're not going to school for this anymore. In fact, the questions may be even more prevalent because we're losing funding to things like humanities departments. And so people are now, as they're entering into their adult years, are like, the questions are just being thrust upon them as they experience their own meaning crises. And so one of the inputs and advice that they had was, well, the questions are still out there. If you can find a way just to bring the discussions and the education to people where they're already exploring, then you'll really have something of value. Now, it might not translate, as you know, it might not translate into like a job per se, but you're finding that there's people actually out there. We just have to bring it to them. And, as I would sit down with young people, we talked about this in our first conversation, I'd sit down with young men in particular, and I'd advise them, hey, pick up this like PhD level book. They're like, dude, I'm not doing that. Like, I can't read at that level. I can't pick up, the tome by Charles Taylor that you're referring to all the time, but I'll go onto YouTube and I'll watch a YouTube video, or I'll go on looking for podcasts while I work. I had some, excuse me, I had some guys just recently telling me, and they do concrete work. And they said, hey, we listen to your podcast while we're working on concrete. And I go, that's amazing. That's so cool. So, I don't know how I got there, but all that to say, I suppose that the questions, as you're obviously finding out, people are still wrestling with the ultimate meaning making questions, and they're just going to these different avenues to try to explore where to find those answers.
Well, I think we're seeing I was frustrated this morning because I'm trying to post onto YouTube. I've already got it on the Podbean channel, the audio channel, a conversation I did yesterday with John Madany. Now, John he sort of grew up parallel to me. His father was the Arabic language minister of the Back to God Hour, which was the radio ministry of the Christian Reformed Church. Most of its ministry is overseas. And so he grew up in South Holland, Illinois. He went to Trinity College, not Calvin. Went out to Utah because he was getting a degree in range studies, studying the grazing land, which is, of course, of the American West is full of that. and eventually became a family practice doctor in a small town in Montana, and he's about my age, I think, and he's lived his life doing that. And, talk to him about, so here's a guy who's a medical doctor, obviously very well educated, educated his children, educated himself so that he can, build a house, do the plumbing and electrical, and do all of those things. But, every day on his ride to work on his bike, he listens to audiobooks, podcasts. He's followed Jordan Peterson. He's been following the Vervaeke stuff. He's been listening to me. And, what I've discovered and again, I've bumbled into most of what has happened to my channel, with just starting to talk to random people who found me, finding all kinds of people like Julian, who's a Hutterite up in Manitoba and spends his days welding dumpsters, but
awesome.
is, the rest of his time reading Kierkegaard and philosophy and living in community. And Mary, who's down in Georgia, who was a Jehovah's witness and converted to Roman Catholicism. And, when you talk to Mary, she's just, brimming full of wisdom and philosophy. And, I could just go on and on and on. And all of these people have, there's Dr. Jim in Idaho, who's a cardiologist, and he comes on my channel and, makes these observations that are just like, wow, I hadn't thought of that. And you very much begin to see and experience that we are all smarter together than alone, and that even though there's been a lot of disruption and dislocation with a lot of the technology that's rushed at us, and for many families and many individuals have suffered because the boundaries that should filter the power of those media have been broken down. Yet through this media, through YouTube, podcasts, the web, blogs, so on and so forth, people from various walks of life are engaging in some of the most vital questions in a highly intelligent way. And as John Vervaeke said to me in my conversation, right now there's sort of a little corner of the internet that, for whatever people think of Jordan Peterson, he sort of exploded it out there for us. And so now, people are carving out little niches and communities where a lot of the old barriers can hopefully be productively transcended, and good conversations where we wrestle with, very difficult issues and ideas can be productively engaged. And I know for people, say, like myself, who comes from a conservative Christian tradition, that was always,
oh yes,
it was always touchy and difficult. And so we're still sort of feeling that out. I don't feel insecure in doing that, given that my particular conservative tradition, via Calvin College, thinkers like Alvin Plantinga, Nicholas Waltersdorf, Evan Runner, the whole bunch of Richard Mao, many of the people in the generation before me kind of mapped out a way to keep barriers, but keep them semi-permeable so we can work through ideas. So what's happening now, I find to be very encouraging. And I really can't take credit for the Discord server. That was the product of a bunch of the guys in our local meetup who have found the meetup so important in their lives that they very much want to share it with others, but how to share it with others. And so we're sort of trying to figure that out as we go along. And the Discord server has become yet another tool by which we can bring people together. And I too, those of us who have put this thing together and have just been amazed at both the openness, the vulnerability, the transparency, but also the responsibility that everyone in the server has shown. I don't know if that scales we'll have to see. But it's been, I was listening to Rebel Wisdom. I was listening to Rebel Wisdom, and David was talking to another YouTuber in sort of in the IDW sphere, and David was saying, I don't really get the same sense of excitement that I had when Jordan Peterson sort of first emerged. And I know what he's saying, but I've actually been continuing to have that same excitement as, the meetups have sort of flourished, and then now the Discord server, and it's been, it's small. It's not Jordan Peterson size, which I think is really very good, because that kind of whoosh, that's really, I've been in churches that have exploded in size, and every pastor imagines that should happen, but having lived through it, it's really hard on people. So it's good to have things grow organically.
It's funny because Kierkegaard argued that like truth is always a minority opinion, and that once it shifts to the majority, the crowd is untruth for Kierkegaard. And I don't know, maybe that was just Kierkegaard has a certain disposition to him that you have to wonder if he went through counseling or had some spiritual director in his life, if he wouldn't be so cynical. But I think this dialogue that people are engaging with, and it is really interesting. They always say you don't go to the comment section on YouTube, and one of the things I found very early on is the algorithm very early on in doing my project had brought up one of your videos, and I was like, oh, I'm going to check out what this is. And then I was like, well, I'm just going to look in the comments. I'm going to look in the comments to see how people respond to this. And I kind of did, one of these things
right
as I was looking, and I was so amazed. And I clicked on a few other videos. I'm like, this is so unique. I mean, even just yesterday, I had tweeted out something in support of an Anabaptist pastor in Canada, a guy by the name of Bruxy Cavey. I just did an interview with, and just saying how charitable he is. And instantly I got a comment from somebody going, well, like just speaking disparagingly of it. I'm like, I have never found that there are some people that I think have been listeners to your program that maybe in our first conversation they jumped over and listened to some of my stuff, and I found all of them, even though they were total strangers, to be really gracious. And it is a really unique thing. I haven't seen that in other forums, so I guess thank God for that, right? But it is a benefit. The theologian J.W. McClendon threw out this idea in his, he's got a systematic theology. It's a 3-volume one, and he comes from a little bit more of a postmodern theology. He's a bit on the Anabaptist side, and it's good. But he threw out this idea that struck me years ago when I first read it. Christians frequently like to make claims in our denominations. We like to make claims that we are part of the one true path, that we could navigate this path all the way back to the apostles, and it's an unbroken line of succession, right? That's everybody's claim, that they think that they're getting that. And maybe some traditions have a little bit easier path than others. I don't know. But he brought up this idea that maybe that's not actually what Christ had intended in John 17 in his high priestly prayer, that we would become one even as he and the Father are one. That instead what Christ had hoped would that each of us, from our different convictional locations, from our ethnic backgrounds, from these like cultural lenses that do color our picture of reality, that what would happen is we would gather together and we would share these positions. And I've compared it to maybe, you climb up a hill and you look out over a valley, but you notice there's other hills around. What you want to do to get a good picture of what's really going on in that valley is you want to compare what you've seen from your particular vantage point, confessing that it's limited, with other people around that valley. And as long as people have an openness, and maybe just everybody that's attracted to your channel scores really high in openness, that could be.
Yeah.
And that's great, because I think you exude that as well. So that's probably what you attract. But as long as people are high in openness, this exchange of ideas can remain profitable, because we all confess. Like I confess as a Christian, I am limited in my ability to see. And on top of that, I was born into this world with a sinful predisposition. that pushes me in the direction of trying to see things my way, of trying to have my biases confirmed. And so, I guess part of the path of discipleship, speaking like as pastors, is to this process of repentance, of metanoia, is to open ourselves up to the possibility of seeing things a new way, which I didn't always have either. And I guess to get to a little bit of my story, if people wanted to hear it at all, I'm a second generation evangelical. So I'm, in a lot of ways, people would point to my life as a child of the 80s and 90s, growing up in evangelicalism, as like the typical evangelical experience. So
Where did you
my,
grow up?
I grew up in the Detroit area
Okay.
in Michigan, and
Okay.
my parents met in college. Both of them, my father came from maybe a nominal Catholic, probably more, I would just say like generally theistic family, but, religion did not play a high priority in their life. My mom, on the other hand, came from a pretty rigid Catholic background. She attended Catholic school. And in the 70s, as the charismatic renewal was happening in the 1970s, my mom and dad both had their born again experience in their college years. And the way that they came into that sort of like born again experience was in somewhat divergent ways. So for my dad had heard, it was kind of some, what you might call, like, this is Christianese, so I have to apologize to those listeners that don't come from this, like relational evangelism.
Mm-hmm.
He was a stud linebacker at Wayne State University, actually set their all-time tackle record as a 5'11", 190-pound middle linebacker. He was probably a bad dude and had some stories that he hasn't even shared with me yet. And it was guys in like Fellowship of Christian Athletes that were just kind of reaching out to him, inviting him to stuff. He heard Bill McCartney speak, who was, the one time was on staff at the University of Michigan, also kind of had that famous Hail Mary play at the University of Colorado, and then went on to do a bunch of stuff with Promise Keepers, which, again, if you're in the evangelical world, you know what that is. If you don't, I don't know how to explain it.
It was a men's. Well, I think there's some connection between this Jordan Peterson
There is,
thing
actually. I was going to
and
say that.
Promise Keepers.
There is.
It was
I
a
was going to say
men's
the
movement.
precursor to
That's
Jordan
right.
Peterson was in the 90s, this reclamation of what, hopefully, at least in their mind, right, like proper masculinity looked like as a follower of Jesus. And so I went as a kid to the Silverdome in Pontiac, Michigan, with 75,000 men and boys to go to a Promise Keepers event with my dad. I don't remember much of it, other than one of the things that really stood out to me was the sound of 75,000 men singing in worship. And that left an imprint on me, as well as some guys on the floor playing hacky sack throughout most of the sessions too. That, as a kid, I don't know, I was probably 9 or 10. I was like, wow, that's so cool. I don't think I listened to any of the speaking, but the singing left an imprint on me. So that was my dad's background. And then, for him, it was more of the life of the mind. He needed to have some serious questions answered. So like, very early on, as he was kind of going through his conversion process, he read, Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict, some of those classic apologetic books. And that really helped win him over. My mom, on the other hand, like, she really couldn't have cared less about that stuff. She was really after the mystical experience. She lived in this, what she would describe, and this isn't the case for all Catholics, but she lived in a very rigid form of Catholicism that, from her impression, was about following rules, following a list of rules to earn salvation. And again, I know that's not Catholicism proper. But she, in her Catholic school experience, if she wasn't sitting with her hands folded at her desk, a nun would come by and slap her hand with a ruler. So for her, she went through this journey of trying to, maybe, to borrow some of the terminology you've been using, and maybe I'm misusing this because I need to refresh my memory and do some more reading on Pascal, but for her, it was more of a spirit of finesse.
Mm-hmm.
and she needed to explore the reality of God on an intuitive, mystical, and supernatural level. And so the charismatic renewal of the 70s really resonated with her. She would go to these meetings and see the miraculous, see deaf ears open, and people getting out of wheelchairs, stuff that for many evangelicals, and probably even in your tradition, they don't have much of a grid for. That's not
Yeah.
been a normal feature
Right.
of church life. So for her, it was, I would say it was more of the spirit of finesse. Maybe my dad was a little bit more of the spirit of geometry, and I'm a product of that. So I grew up in a very charismatic tradition, and
Did you
spent
go to
actually.
mass then growing up?
No. We didn't actually. I'm sorry. So to clarify, they became full-on born-again
Okay.
evangelicals in their
Okay.
college years, got married,
Okay.
became involved with a non-denominational church. The founding pastors of this church had grown up like fundamentalist Southern Baptists, got, as we were calling it at the time, and it sounds dismissive of other traditions, probably because it was, they got filled with the Spirit,
Yep. Yep.
as
Yep.
if the other Christians didn't. They
Yep.
had the full gospel,
Yep.
as
Yep.
opposed to whatever percent other traditions had. They became full gospel, filled with the Spirit. And so
Spirit baptism.
Spirit baptism, speaking in tongues. But excuse me, there was this unique thing going on because the founding pastors came from this fundamentalist Southern Baptist, no dancing, no card playing, very, very legalistic. But now they had that with a bunch of charismatic flair to it. And so I grew up in that church, and that church actually had a K through 12 Christian school, which is a pretty new feature. That was a result of kind of the culture war stuff that was happening in the late 70s, you get into the early 80s. And the kind of evangelical right is starting to develop. So people were taking this Christ against culture, to use H.R. Niebuhr's language, Christ against culture approach, and we're going to make our own separate schools with its own separate way of doing science,
Mhm.
with its own separate language. And I'm appreciative in some regard for the reasons why they did that.
Mhm.
When you see such massive cultural changes that happened as a result of like the sexual revolution and just changing values, I understand why they did that. And in many ways, I'm thankful for my Christian school experience. But it was, if you can imagine, the most fundamentalist Southern Baptist, but also mix in like Oral Roberts and Kenneth Copeland.
Wow.
And I joke, and my parents they listen to much of the stuff that I do, and they're fine with the way I retell this. But part of my like daily devotionals as a kid, by the time I was in the 90s, was to read Kenneth Copeland's daily devotional. If you don't know who Kenneth Copeland is, he is,
Wow.
prosperity gospel
Yeah.
poster boy #1, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. He's got a jet.
he does. He has a jet. So another thing that might be weird to people, but was normal to me, I probably went to like 4 or 5 Benny Hinn crusades as a kid.
Wow.
So that was the
Yeah.
world I
Yeah. Yeah.
inhabited.
Yeah.
Um, and very early on, though, I began to realize that one of the primary sacraments in the charismatic church, we never use that language,
Right.
was music. It's one of the unique features of our stream is the emphasis on music as a means of grace.
Yep.
Nobody says it like that, but what they will say is the presence of God was in worship. What are they saying what do they mean when they say that? In hindsight, I look back and I go, well, in a lot of ways, it's similar to what maybe Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, how they treat the Eucharist, right?
Yep.
God is really, really here. And in fact, one story from my childhood as a freshman in high school at my K through 12 Christian school, we did chapel every week and it was pretty blasé. We had a full-on revival hit our school. It was not long after some of the stuff that was happening, let's say in like Toronto, for
Yeah.
people that maybe have any
Toronto
familiarity,
blessing.
the Toronto Blessing, the Brownsville revival down in Florida. These were kind of the worlds we were occupying, and something like that hit my Christian school where our normal chapel got hijacked and the worship didn't stop. And I still look back on it as one of the most formative experiences in my life, because that day, again, though we were charismatics have their own liturgy just like everybody else, and you can learn to just go through the motions of that liturgy without any sort of meaningful connection to how this applies to your life. And that day in chapel, I just felt like overwhelmed all of a sudden. And this isn't a spirit of geometry thing that's happening in me.
No.
This is on the intuitive level. I'm overwhelmed with a sense of transcendence. I'm crying. I don't know why I'm crying. I'm going over and repenting to teachers that I've cheated on their tests for. I don't know why nobody told me to do this. And I'm looking around, and this is happening all over the room.
Yeah.
And the worship music didn't stop that day. Thankfully, like, the administrators had the wherewithal. They canceled class, and we literally, from morning to the rest of the day, was just singing and praying for each other.
Yeah.
And then, I'm 13 years old or so at the time, and a bunch of us are like, man, this is awesome, but we know our parents have got to pick us up at the end of the day here. Do we have to stop? And they were like, well, let's talk to them and see if we can come back tonight and do this again. And so we did. And then we did it.
Yeah, parents are going to say no. The parents.
I know. Exactly. So of course they don't say no. And so we're doing this nightly, and eventually the parents start coming and showing up. And before we know it, we had gone for several months, as many people as we could fit into our sanctuary. That was also a gym, which was also the place we ate lunch, which we called the Sanctinasium. Not even joking. The Sanctinasium was its name. And we had 400 people nightly, and like genuine repentance, was happening. People were changing their lives and all sorts of stuff, but it all revolved around musical expression. Musical expression of worship was our sacrament. And that left a huge impression on me, because when I got into my college years, and I felt a call to ministry, well, the thing that made the most sense to me was, well, music. Like, this is the thing that helps me commune with God. I've seen how it's helped other people commune with God. And I'm in this charismatic space where music is the main course. And in many cases, the preaching is like the side dish or the dessert, if you even get to it. Which is, honestly, like, I know this is so hard for some people to wrap their mind around. And it is even in the current church I'm at, which is just an old free church. To imagine a pastor getting up when he should be getting ready to preach, and he grabs the microphone and goes, well, we're just not going to stop worshiping this morning. And he goes and sits back down, and we do that for 2 hours. It's really, really hard for people that haven't grown up in that to understand what that's like. So as I'm thinking about what does it look like to bless the world, what does it look like to follow Jesus, to help people, that's the thing that I feel called to do. So by 19, I was already doing a pastoral internship at my non-denominational church. The pastors had a crazy idea. Well, let's send this 19-year-old kid out to plant a church, which is a terrible idea. Terrible idea. I'm thankful for it.
All over again.
It is in an area that was like 45 minutes away. We didn't know anybody. And it was, again, the pastor using the spirit of finesse, intuiting, going, I just feel like the Lord is calling us to go there, which is just normal in charismatic culture.
Yeah.
It's just normal. It's people talk about the Lord spoke to me. The Lord spoke to me, and the Lord said this, and you just throw that around, and like nobody ever questions it. And I know some people that come out of that are really, really hurt by those experiences. I'm not hurt. I've been able to come full circle and appreciate some of what was going on there. So they sent me out to plant a church. The church failed. There was, all sorts of scandals that happened at our home church, sadly. And, but anyways, as I get in my
one of the things I love about the charismatics is just that and some people look at that like a bug. It's like, well, God called us to do this, and so a rational, logical Calvinist looks at that and says, yeah, but that failed. And they're like, oh, but God's calling us to do this over here. And it's like, wait,
the
wait,
goalposts just move.
That's right. But it's like, well, this is what we're doing. And I know I have a friend who his father, his stepfather is so this way, and it just drives him crazy. And I understand why it drives him crazy, but part of me just watches it and thinks, gosh, part of me wants to be more like that, because
Yeah,
I do the postmortem and why didn't God show up?
totally.
It's like on to the next thing.
Well, again, at the current church where I'm at, which is again an old free church, it's the oldest in the city of Minneapolis, 140-year-old congregation. I mean, they didn't stop speaking Swedish until like 1930 or 40 as a Swedish only. One of the reasons I think they brought me in was because of my charismatic background and them going, we want some of that here. We don't know how, but we see that you have these experiences. So anyways, as I got into early years of ministry, it was all revolving around this idea of worship, music as a means of communion with God. And so very early on, I got involved in a parachurch ministry for 2 years, traveling around the country, helping churches establish what we called houses of prayer. And the goal of these, there was this movement that really began in the late 90s. But we would always say it goes back all the way to Ziesendorf, who had a really long, we'd always say with some evangelical license that he had 100-year-long prayer meeting that launched the largest missions movement in the history of the church, which was somewhat true. What we didn't realize is that it wasn't like nonstop for 100 years, but there were places like the International House of Prayer in Kansas City. In 1999, they started a prayer meeting, and it hasn't stopped yet, which I know many of your listeners probably aren't familiar with. They take 2-hour shifts around the clock to have worship, music, and prayer happening. And you can just go in that room and you could just sit there for as long as you want, almost like a monastic sort of retreat.
Were they
So,
connected with the Kansas City Prophets as well?
oh, yes, definitely. Latter rain movement.
Yeah.
Yep, definitely. So I was heavily involved in those circles, traveling around the country with other people in their early 20s, telling pastors that are in their 50s, what you need to do to fix your church is to get your church together with a bunch of other churches and to just pray and worship round the clock. So I'd go into a city and we'd connect with the churches there that were open to doing this. And we go, all right, we're going to go for 24 hours. So let's get 5-6 churches around the city together and have your worship team, your intercessory team, which is again, a unique feature of charismatic life oftentimes, and your pastors, and commit to a 2-hour block of time to come in and pray for the city, seek the heart of God, all of this stuff. Because what we really believed, so this is what I was pretty convinced of very early on, that this was part of the latter rain movement that, Bob Jones, Mike Bickle, these are some of the
Yep.
people
Yep.
involved in those
Yep.
streams, was that before Christ could return,
Yep.
there needed to be the restoration of the tabernacle of David, right? Now, what we didn't get, and still many people don't, was that, the early church understood that prophecy is already being fulfilled at Pentecost. We were seeing it as much more of a literal setting up of Davidic style worship in cities across the world. And when we would do that, Christ would return. So you often hear about in Revelation, it talks about the harp and the bowls of incense, which is the prayer of the saints. And Revelation has this picture of this bowl being filled up with incense. And when that gets filled up, it's like, well, now the seals can be unlocked and we can go, we needed this to happen before Christ could return. That was kind of our way of understanding. So I'm saying deep in charismatic culture. And Paul, I have seen wild stuff, even in the midst of that. Like I was already like dabbling with Kierkegaard, A.W. Tozer, those were some people that played big influences on me. In a lot of ways, I've shared this before, like Greg Boyd is a gateway drug for charismatics into theology, because we have to have a framework for why our prayers make a difference. We have to have a framework for truly believing that God doesn't want this person sick. So Greg's open theism sort of provided that kind of framework for petitionary prayer to make sense. So I'm getting a little bit more into theology. Simultaneously, I'm already teaching Bible classes at a Christian high school. I'm going through this stuff, and I'm shifting, I'm going through a theological evolution here. I'm going through a process of a little bit of deconstruction while I'm in the middle of this. So I was never one that was like fully on board with the entirety of charismatic culture. I always had a little bit of maybe my dad going, I need evidence, right? Like I need a little bit of spirit of geometry here. But I tell you what, Paul, I've seen some wild things. I mean, I was in Ontario, Windsor, Ontario. Somebody said, hey, can you come out and do worship? We're doing this street thing for the homeless. And we're going to pray for the people there that can't afford insurance. We're going to just see if God heals them. And I would just do my silly 4-chord worship songs. And they're like, all right, we're going to start praying for these really poor people in Windsor, which is very similar in some pockets to Detroit. And I saw deaf people, like, their ears open. I've seen wild things that I still don't know what to do, that I am usually tempted to say are like demonic counterfeit. I remember being at a meeting one time, I'm doing worship, the guest speaker that's coming in is preaching, he's praying for people at the end. We go out to Denny's after, and the guy's covered in gold dust. And he had no time. Like, I walked with him the whole way, and there was this weird thing happening in charismatic circles with like feathers emerging in meetings and actual jewels. I've got a friend of mine who doesn't even like really believe in all this stuff, who keeps a bag of these jewels, these like, your listeners are going to be so weird.
Say it, man. You got to say this.
Even my listeners, I haven't talked about this stuff in my podcast at all.
I love it. I love it. Keep going. I got to grab my water bottle. I'm still
go for it. He keeps a bag of these, like, I still don't know what we would call them. These like gemstones that seem like they've just miraculously emerged in these meetings out of nowhere. Yeah. I have a friend. I could send people pictures of this if I still have it on my phone somewhere. And he was a guitar player, and all of the frets on his guitar turned to gold. He took it to his luthier one day. He hadn't even realized it. And the luthier, who wasn't even like a believer, was like, dude, what the F did you do to your guitar? He's like, what are you talking about? He's like, your frets on your guitar are all gold. He's like, man, I don't know. We just had some awesome time of worship the other night. So,
but this is to me, because, so I obviously have my fingers in all sorts of pies now, in relationships with all sorts of persons. And I know full well that many of the people listening to this will just yell, bullshit.
Yeah, go for it.
These things don't happen. But the thing is, places like you and I have been, we're not making this stuff up.
No, I don't want to make it up. I'd rather not be telling you this right now. It's kind of embarrassing because I like to pride myself now as, being someone who has a, good sense of theological awareness, and as a teacher, and, and in my context, I'd never talk about this on a Sunday morning. Get run out of the church, but here I am putting it on the internet for everybody to hear. Anyways, so that I was deep in charismania, deep in it. But I started experiencing so much cognitive dissonance because, again, and somebody can correct me, and maybe you can, that has a better grasp of Pascal than I. I have not really done much with Pascal, but as you've talked about this sort of spirit of finesse, charismatic culture is all about finesse. It's about the intuitive side, not so much the cognitive side. And I've always joked, I heard always that seminaries were cemeteries. And we heard this framework for, the disciples, who was the educated people? The Pharisees. Who was uneducated? The disciples that actually followed Jesus. And there's some truth there, right? That's part of like the rich history of the Pentecostal tradition, is that it actually takes what the reformers were saying and it takes it seriously, the priesthood of all believers. They're like, dude, you don't need to go to seminary. You had a crazy vision where God took you into the throne room. Oh, that's good enough for us. We'll put you on the poster for the next conference. and like, that's your verification. You are verified not by your education in those circles, but by your intuitive, experiential, mystical experiences.
And by your accomplishments too, though, sometimes.
Yes, definitely. That's definitely the case.
If you gathered a group of people together, if you established, more of the seeker language, a prevailing church, then, so that's important. That's an important piece.
Certainly is. But it's just different, in the denominations that we are part of right now, that they're looking for what sort of formal education and experiences that you've had, not tell us about the wildest vision you had. And we laugh about it, but that is actually the criteria for it. And so I was in that world, but what I found was this sort of anti-life of the mind
Yeah.
was so damaging to so many people
Yeah.
too, because they're like, we're only going to use this to, God is always unmapped territory, right? To map him out seems like it's idolatry, or to approach the scriptures with using like historical grammatical exegesis. No, what you do is you get around in a circle. And I was telling someone else about this. You'd get around in the circle with your Bible and you'd go, all right, let's just keep reading until we feel something jump off the page, and let's talk about what it means.
Yep. Yep.
So
Yep.
in a lot of ways, we talked about this before. In a lot of ways, I know people were actually, after our first conversation, reached out to me, maybe upset with me, that really like Peterson and really like his biblical series. But I know we talked about this before. That's my least favorite part of Peterson's stuff, is his biblical series, because I hear him and I go, this is what we did as charismatics. We haven't consulted a commentary. We haven't consulted a biblical scholar, and we're doing like psychological personal analyses of what these things mean to us. I know that's not totally fair to Peterson's work.
And I think it's helpful to remember that this, even though in the anti-intellectualism within this tradition, that's always, and I think both sides participate in it, that's always imagined as a binary thing. You know, I remember when Jonathan Pageau made a comment, I think he made it on Twitter, something to the fact like, the last person you're going to find anything worthwhile about the Bible from is a biblical scholar. And so I kind of pushed back on that, because this isn't a binary thing, because of course Pageau is, he knows the evangelical charismatic movement too, but his angle out of it is obviously the symbolic world and the work of himself and his brother, and so it's not binary. It's not use your head or use your heart. These are not binaries here, and there are many angles into this, and there's a reason I have a wall full and thousands of dollars invested in biblical commentaries, not because they're useless or not because they're all that there is, but it's helpful.
It is. It's inherited
right.
wisdom.
Yep.
And to reject that inherited wisdom means, my undergrad was in history. So part of the dilemma I was coming up against was it seemed like many times charismatics had no sense of history at all. It's like we would talk about the good old days of the early church, the Book of Acts church, that was our model. But everything between Acts and like Azusa Street, was like a failure, and I'm going, well, I'm looking at some of the things that we're doing, and I'm looking at some of the ways that people have been actually really, really hurt because they felt like they had to check their minds at the door. We had some friends that were involved in the community, and it's so heartbreaking because they were such sincere people, but in that community, they got so into like this dispensationalist end time stuff and listening to people, various prophets, prophetic words about what was going to happen to Israel. They felt like they had to start stockpiling to have resources in their house so that they could one day possibly, host Jewish people that are going to be, under another Holocaust. And they were living constantly in anxiety. And boy, like so much of that, you go, all right, this isn't totally unmapped territory here. There's been people in our past that have wrestled with the scriptures, and, Revelation isn't that freaky. In fact, a lot of it makes sense in a first century context if you read it with the assumption, so anyways, that was part of my journey. And I'd already been teaching for years. I was into theology, but I was really brushing up against, here's the thing I was realizing was that there, and I talk quite a bit about this. I just did like a month ago, a series on Christ and culture. And we talked a little bit about this framework for how within our, our larger culture, but also within the smaller, cultures that we inhabit in our communities, this total way of life for a people group or community, how spirit, that is, the meta stories we believe, the supreme values, you've talked about this quite a bit. And one of the things I did diss Jordan Peterson, but I listened to him quite frequently. I just have nuanced critiques. And one of the things I think Peterson gets spot on, you brought this up quite a bit with the interviews with Sam Harris, was this idea that to just start talking about God and just to assume that Sam Harris doesn't believe in God is false, because what Peterson gets at is that we all, he says, I live as if God exists. But my thing, and this is influenced by guys like Charles Taylor, James K. Smith, we all live as if a God exists, because God is that which we give the totality of our lives to. And that God is the thing that informs our values. And our values are expressed in these areas of our life. So there's a liberation theologian, Dwight Hopkins, and you were talking in one episode, and I had already been familiar with Dwight Hopkins' work and had used it already. Dwight Hopkins talked about in culture that we have these like 3 domains to the totality of our lives. We have spirit, and spirit again is like the domain of our ethos, the transcendent ideas, the invisible like meta stories we believe, these supreme values. And then we also have in our culture, our total way of life, we also have the aesthetic. And the aesthetic is the creative expression of spirit. So how does spirit, which is invisible, how do values, which are invisible, become visible? Well, they take on a particular aesthetic. It's the creative expression of spirit manifest in arts, stories that we actually write and tell or capture in film. It's captured in works of beauty. And the thing that I started to realize is, you've talked a bit about this, and listening to Jordan Peterson was, the aesthetic is actually a portal. It's a portal to spirit. It's both a way that I've maybe described it as, I don't know if I've actually talked about this in a podcast or not, but with other people is, it's like Jacob's ladder, the story of Jacob's ladder in the scriptures, right? Jacob's ladder, when Jacob falls asleep, he sees these angels both ascending, meaning, going up, and descending, coming down. So this domain of spirit, which is totally invisible, right? Like our values are invisible. To say you want something to be good in your life, well, that goodness or the desire for beauty is an invisible value, but it is made visible in our lives. So the aesthetic is like this portal, right? It's like a doorway. It's like Jacob's ladder. The ideas expressed out in the works of beauty that we make, but it's also a way when other people see it, they see through that, and then they get to see through that doorway into the realm of spirit. So what I was able to realize, I should probably bring up the third category for Hopkins, and that's Hopkins talks about culture as labor. So spirit, I'll do this in the camera so people can see, spirit is at the top of the hierarchy, right? And then you have, well, maybe I'll put it over here in reverse, aesthetic, and then you have labor at the bottom of this pyramid. And labor is just the human work of adapting or repurposing the natural world that we find ourselves in for individual or community benefit. So it's the work that we do. It also, that domain also encompasses things like the politics, which is the, part of that is the human exchange of the fruits of our work and the sorts of agreements that we make between each other about how we should treat each other. That's all labor. And so labor and aesthetic are always subordinate to spirit. Which is why, like the biblical prophets, this is so fascinating. You read the Old Testament prophets and you read Amos or Jeremiah or even Isaiah 1. I always talk about Isaiah 1 because Isaiah 1 is so fascinating, because you've got this entire like liturgical system of worship set up under Moses, right? Requires sacrifices. It's an aesthetic, right? It's a liturgy, but it's also a room filled with these things like the, cherubim on the Ark of the Covenant. You can't make an image of God, right? And this is the key thing, because the true God is beyond creation. He is transcendent. So you can't make an image of him. But what you can do is you can put cherubim
Yes.
on it.
Isn't that fascinating?
Right? You can put these other things, these aesthetic expressions that are supposed to, right, mimic.
There are images.
There
just
are
not of
images,
God.
not of God, because the ultimate the problem with idolatry, and this is Romans 1, right, is that we settle for the created thing above the creator. And what that ultimately is just dysfunctional. It's in a dysfunctional allegiance of our worship. And so that dysfunction, this is like Christian theology. What flows out of that dysfunction is death, because we move ourselves away from the transcendent source. So, I mean, this is like Athanasius, right? Athanasius, on the incarnation, God has to step into the story, but what is he doing? He's stopping human trajectory towards death, right? For Augustine, for Gregory of Nyssa, evil is the privation of good, right? It's not its own category. It's moving away. I think it was either Augustine or Gregory of Nyssa that said, like Satan's first sin was just closing his eyes to the good, So back to Isaiah 1, Isaiah's like, hey, on behalf of God, your sacrifices, the things God told you to do, they're worthless to me. I don't need the blood of bulls and rams. What I need is for you guys to treat the poor and the oppressed the right way. Why is that? It's because what was being made manifest in their labor was the actual expression of the God that they worshiped. And what were they worshiping? They're worshiping idols. So there's this deep connection between that injustice and them, the people of Israel, going outside. Solomon let this happen, right? King Solomon let the institution of high places happen. And what was those high places? Those were places of like child sacrifice. So we know outside of the walls of Jerusalem, in the place called the Valley of Hinnom, which for those, maybe they've grown up in the church, maybe they know some of this stuff, but even I didn't until I got older. The Valley of Hinnom is Gehenna. So when we get into the New Testament, Valley of Hinnom is the location where people sacrificed their children on the altars of Molech outside of the walls of the city of Jerusalem. They literally put them on this bronze statue that had its hands, I'll put it out like this, had its hands shaped like that. And then they would put their children in the hands of Molech. They were willing to kill their children for the values of Molech. And so they're burning their kids out there. And then what happens? The warning comes to Israel and Jeremiah. Nebuchadnezzar's coming to town, and guess what's going to happen? Your dead bodies are going to get stacked in the Valley of Hinnom. Like, that's the judgment. And then when Jesus in the New Testament talks about hell, all save for two places. For example, one of the places where he doesn't use this word is in the story of Lazarus and the rich man, and that's actually Hades.
Yep.
But pretty much every other case, when Jesus talks about hell in the Gospels, when you see that in English, it's the word Gehenna. And what's Gehenna? It's just the Greek transliteration of the Valley of Hinnom.
Yeah.
So judgment's coming, and this is what's going to happen, is that as you worship these wrong ideas, so these values get made manifest in your life as fruits of death, destruction, killing your children, oppressing the poor. And what that's going to lead to is death. So essentially what the prophets are saying is like, your aesthetic, your liturgy doesn't match your labor. Your labor is the actual expression, and your aesthetic together are the actual expression of the God that you worship. And I can say, once we start talking and framing the discussion around that, like, I'm so thankful you're doing, I'm so thankful Jordan Peterson is helping people reframe this notion of God from, the silly new atheist claim. I don't worship some God in the sky. It's like, no, that's never been what the Christian God is. It's never even been for Jews or Muslims what God is. It's like, it's just somehow naming that, like Anselm said, that God was that which we could think no higher than. We are always able to see in people's lives the God that they worship, that which they can think no higher than, gives them their values. The values are expressed in our aesthetic and our labor. So I don't know, how do we get there? That's usually how these conversations go, right, Paul?
Well, Karis, so let's get back to your story. Although I do want to mention something, because I've I've certainly, and a part of my audience knows my critique of what I call woke religion or progressive liberationism. But part of what I am most annoyed, what most annoys me by that movement is, in fact, that the biblical long-standing tradition of what was always known as social justice, that was never a
Yeah.
bad word in my
No.
vocabulary, actually becomes an idol, because then suddenly, oh, it's your anti-oppression that is now your idol. It's like,
Mm,
no, wait a minute. The anti-oppression, the reason you're against oppression is because of all of this. And
mm-hmm.
it's because of God. So it's one integrated thing. It's not, well, now we can get rid of God because we have anti-oppression. And it's like, no, that the reason for anti-oppression is that these are image bearers of God. And it does not deny that oppression is real or
Exactly.
exists, or even that it is too great for us. This is a foe greater than what we can manage, like so many other things in this world and in our lives. But so that has to be properly placed. Otherwise, when it gets to the top of the hierarchy, it does become an idol. And then you have all of the death around it that we see in potential in this movement. And it's exactly what you laid out is, I think very well, very nicely articulating the movement, that itself, your anti-oppression, then becomes death.
The spirit, yeah, the domain of spirit always directs our sense of how things ought to be, right? So even you could take like the woke religions, you know, where are they getting their sense of ought from? The sense of ought in many ways, and I think like guys like Charles Taylor, James K. Smith can highlight this stuff much better than I, but that we are, I got even Nietzsche saw it, that we are still, though God is dead in many ways in Western civilization, like the news hasn't reached the ears of common people, so we are still deriving certain senses of our ought from this Christian story, like why I am really sympathetic for why there are people that really, really passionately care about marginalized people and the oppressed. They should, right? Where does that come from, though? Where does that sense of ought come from? And then what is the telos? What's, so actually, like, I think a lot of the stuff that we see is these sort of substitute secular religions in a secular age have this eschatological drive. And what I mean by that is they have a sense that we are heading towards somewhere. Now, the Christian story has said we are heading towards the restoration of all things, new heavens, new earth. They still want to head towards maybe a utopian picture of that, but they want to deny where ultimately that picture is going to come from, how it's going to actually, what are the guidelines for what restoration looks like? What is a functional picture of reality? And I simultaneously have to confess, though I have these convictions, part of my Christian conviction, as we already talked about, is I've got a limited perspective on this. So I want to dialogue with other people. But what I would say, and I feel like this is rationally makes sense, and it's also on an intuitive level makes sense, that we have to keep pushing beyond the created thing, keep going to ultimate reality. What is that thing which I can think no higher of, but is actually the thing that should be at the top of our, we might say, like our hierarchy of values. So we got to keep pushing towards that. So I think there are concerns when we go, all right, people feel like they have this strong ethical compass. They think that progress is moving in any direction as long as it's away from the past. And I go, I just want to know what is the telos here? What's the
Yeah.
end game? And I can kind of say it as a Christian. Like I have this vision that I have accepted because, yes, by faith, this is a process, but the vision that I have is like a people of every tribe and tongue, you know? So I do have value for those that are being oppressed because I see this picture in new creation of them, the kings of all the nations, bringing their gifts, and I see the light of Christ illuminating the entirety of the world. So I can confess honestly, like, that's the direction I'm moving towards. And if you disagree, that's fine. I'd like to learn from you. Would you like to learn from me? But there's a fundamentalist attitude in some of the substitute secular religions that I go, oh, I've smelled this before.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
That's just,
smelled this.
it's like, oh, I know this.
Yeah, I've been this. I've been this. But at least, I just want to be able to say, like, I confess that I have these convictions, but I want to show my cards on them. Do you want to show your cards? And we can like kind of talk about where these convictions come from.
So anyway, back to Charismania.
Yeah.
And then you were teaching high school.
Oh yeah. I was teaching high school. Like most of my adult life, I've been in bivocational ministry where I was teaching high school, like theology, biblical studies courses. Really fruitful years of doing that. Really enjoyed that, but simultaneously have also been on staff at churches, and most of that has looked like 20 hours a week of being at a church on staff as their worship pastor, or and then the other 40 hours a week being in a full-time teaching role. So even as I've gone through like my own theological journey, and then I went through my seminary process, I still hold these, and this is part of, I think you've got an ultimate project. Like there's a problem you're sorting out in your own mind, right? You're doing this, and this is why you're having conversations with people. And I'm doing the same thing. Yes, it's to help people, but I'm also like sorting through. I'm searching as well. And so part of this project for me has been just how do I make the right brain, left brain work together? How do we have transcendence and immanence? How do we see God in both? God number one, God number two, geometry, finesse. And like, how do we do that in a healthy way? Because I've seen both imbalances. I've seen imbalances where there are people that just go, there are certain Christian traditions, right, that just go, essentially what they're doing is following a rationalism, but a rationalism where they're deriving everything from their particular reading of a really old book. But God can't presently speak in any sort of intuitive way to them, because that would be somehow like a challenge to the authority of that book. And that's one of the things, like, I think healthy charismatics can go, hang on. Like, we do submit ourselves to an authority that is beyond us. We don't just trust our gut on stuff. And yet, like, how did these scriptures come to be? If we actually believe in something like the inspiration of scripture, we have to confess that that these people have sort of finessed their way into telling the story of God. So that has to be an option on the table. So I still hold to that, right? I still hold to that. I'm working through this process. I think I even shared with you a while back, like even going through this process of being a charismatic who's an evangelical. The evangelical side is we did communion once a month, right? We did communion once a month, and it was just the symbolic thing that honestly, as a kid, I went, I don't know why we're doing this, but it also seems important enough that I don't come, we'd hear this verse about if we didn't come with, clean hands, that we might be heaping God's judgment on ourselves. I'm like, wow, maybe we shouldn't just do this at all. Can we just like not do it once a month and not worry about that? I'd be so freaked out. Like, I don't know what this is. I know it's symbolic.
Yeah.
I hear this verse that we could be heaping judgment on ourselves if we do it in an unright manner.
Yeah.
So I went through this process, like probably 2010, 2011, of maybe as going through a sense of like, I don't understand the Eucharist at all. I don't understand why this is valuable. I was able to see how I was treating in our context at this time. 2010, I was still deep in, charismatic circles, serving on staff at a charismatic church, going, okay, I kind of get this because I treat music like this, right? I treat music as the means of grace. I talk about like the presence of God is here. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean somehow that he's endowing our aesthetic expression with a doorway to communing with him. So that was pretty normal for me, even though like we kind of made fun of people who talked about, well, Christ is present in bread and wine. And you'd go, like, really? In the food? But then the people that have grown up with that are going, you really think God shows up in your notes and in your melodies?
And those sound waves?
In those sound waves, it's the same thing, right? So
Yeah,
music was the
yeah.
sacrament that bridged together the spiritual domain and the physical domain. It like united those domains. And so I started doing some digging on it. I had a history background. This is actually before I went to seminary, and I'm getting exposed to, traditions outside of myself. Really enjoyed learning from Eastern Orthodox, and I actually found a lot of harmony between ideas that we had in our charismatic circles about, we talk about intimacy with the Lord, and the Eastern Orthodox talk about theosis, right? And so we had this very strong sense of what God was actually after was some sort of union that was really like marriage, you know? And then I was like, oh, the Eastern Orthodox, they hold to this too. That's kind of cool. Let me start reading some stuff about this. So, you know, part of the thing, and even one of the things I reached out to you about was as I started going through this and reflecting on it again recently, even on some of your talks where I forget who you were talking to, maybe it was Ron Dart, about, why in the Reformation, like, it was such a big deal, like worth people wanting to kill each other over, as to whether or not we were talking about transubstantiation, consubstantiation, or symbolism. I started to get it a little bit. I hadn't really understood what all the fuss was about. I was like, well, you do you, right? Like, but what I started to see was actually, like, I think you've done a good job of, like, just wrestling with these ideas, Paul. It's like what we're really talking about is like the nature of reality, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
And like how we can actually commune in immanence with a God who is both immanent and transcendent. So, you know, I've been thinking more about this. I want to throw it out to you because we didn't have an opportunity to dialogue about it. To me, I've almost wondered if I'm a Calvinist when it comes to the Eucharist, because Calvin had this kind of unique perspective that didn't fit Luther.
Yeah.
It didn't fit the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
He's like, it's not just a symbol.
Right.
And it's like nothing is just a symbol, right?
Right.
I mean, I think that's like
Right.
Jonathan Pageau's project, who I've watched some of Jonathan's stuff. I'm not as familiar with his work as you and maybe some of the listeners are. It's just only so much stuff that you can familiarize yourself with. But I feel like his point is like, no. Nothing is just symbol. So, I guess I've been thinking about how this connection, again, going back to spirit and aesthetic and labor, is really the means of grace, metanoia. Is it the changing of one's perspective? Is it like the reorienting of their meaning-making systems towards God? Is that really what and it, because we have, I might say, boy, like I felt God in music. And person B might say, I felt his presence in the Eucharist. And then, just some transcendentalist might just go, man, I felt God when I was walking through the park. And I go, okay, I'm just processing. Are there these exclusive lists of means of grace? The church has, across a variety of spectrums, has said, that we have these particular sacraments, right? But what are the sacraments? I think that's what I've been wrestling with recently, is like, is it just whatever speech act? So like a speech act is an act of communication. And is it really, all of these are just important speech acts that we bless baptism, we bless the Eucharist, because we want to hold on to these historic speech acts, these demonstrations of God's story in a particular way that make us aware of his story. And is in that awareness, is it the going, I want to follow that story? Is that really where the means of grace happens?
Well, there's a reason we call, at the end of the Christian story, which isn't the end of the story, but it's the end of this dispensation, if I may use that word in a non-dispensational way, is what's called the consummation. And
yes.
And that's we use about the only other place we tend to use that word is we ask if the marriage was consummated. And by that, we mean that the couple had gone through the ceremony, they had made the vows, oaths were taken, oaths were witnessed, and now, and obviously in some traditions, historic traditions, there was even a certain amount of witnessing going on to that the marriage was consummated. And in the Roman Catholics struggling with divorce, then they have annulment, which is like, well, it was never really consummated. So, Tim Keller so I followed Tim Keller's work quite closely in the middle of the aughts, and so I listened to his stuff back into, his church really took off with 9/11. It's kind of an interesting thing that the Celebrity Atheist took off in 9/11 and Tim Keller. I thought, well, there's an interesting pair. But one of the things that Tim Keller noted in a kind of a small group thing that was recorded, and I've never been able to quite find this recording again, was his observation, which I think he gets from Lovelace, who was one of his seminary professors, was that revival happens, and that's a word that you can identify with, and it's shown up in our talk here, and not to be diminished in terms of just a tent and some sawdust. But revival happens when, in a sense, all of these streams, Richard Foster has Streams of Living Water, just looking for the book. I've got it somewhere here.
Everybody should read that.
When all of the streams come together, that's so, and what we mean by revival are these moments in history. One happened in the early 20th century in Korea, where in a culture where saving face was, at the top of the hierarchy, prominent leaders publicly confessed to their sins before people of lower status to themselves. It just broke open the culture, and a quarter to 40% of the Korean population in downstream of this becomes Christians. It happened, and you have the Great Awakenings. It happened at the beginning of the Methodist movement. Some of those things happened in the Protestant Reformation was enormously messy and problematic in many ways, but it happened there. And so there are these moments in time, and it seems to and what happens in these moments is sacramentality becomes full on. And my trying to piece, I got into Jordan Peterson because I saw glimpses of a reunification of some things, and because I was just continually annoyed by the splitness of so many areas, and it's like, now these things have to come together. And I saw glimpses of that in Peterson, and I wanted to dig in deeper and figure out why this is happening. But no, and so along the way, I began to notice, the fight over the sacrament, which is the colloquy at the Marburg colloquy, I think that was it, just off the top of my head, where you had Luther and Zwingli, and where they tried to not let the Reformation split apart, which it did. This was all a big part of this was about the sacrament. And I had parroted a lot of my rather dismissive language about bread into body, and some Roman Catholics in my comment section kind of called me out on it and said, go listen to Bishop Barron on this. And I listened to Bishop Barron, and I thought, boy, Calvin, in a sense, sort of fudges, because he said, well, I can't put this together. So let's say that Jesus is spiritually present in the sacrament. It's like, oh boy, there's that word again. What do we mean by that? And I really I caught that Dwight Hopkins stuff in your first Christ and Culture podcast that you did, where you laid some of that out. And I thought that was really helpful. So, we are, in a sense, the rebellion or the fall is the breaking, our break with God, and we're looking for the consummation where we're reunited and heaven and earth are one. And the Bible has how many different ways of talking about that. And so I love how early in this conversation you noted, and when you said it, it was like, bang, that's exactly right, because I dabbled in that charismatic movement too in the 80s. I went to a Christian Reformed church in Grand Rapids, Michigan that had some speaking in tongues in it, but it wasn't, it was much more similar to the charismatic movement rather than Pentecostal. The church maintained its Reformed doctrine, but practiced and was, trying to practice openness to the Spirit and so on and so forth. So music was very much sacramental in that charismatic movement. I mean, that became worship and still is for many, many people. And it became worship because what you had in that experience was, this mystical experience of I'm lost in worship to God. Now, there was some deconstruction of that, which you can find in, comedy on the internet about, the smoke machine. But so here again, we have, okay, you have that sacrament. And one of the things, talking to some Roman Catholics, I talked to Carlos, who you can find in the Discord server. He's part of Opus Dei, a Catholic revival movement. And talking to some Catholics who are terrifically impressed with miracles surrounding the Eucharist, that the Catholics have these traditions of that. And it's in sense parallel to something like the Toronto Blessing. And
Wow.
And of course, materialists will look at this and say, no, not gold dust. I have a movie that I got from somebody who did, and I'll have to put the link of that movie in the notes because.
Finger of God?
What's that?
Is it called The Finger of God?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that was my world. So if anybody checks that out, that was the world I was living in at that time when that came out. So.
And what struck me, and I can blame some of C.S. Lewis for this, because of course I was raised on the Chronicles of Narnia and raised on the little chat, and this is just so crazy. The little chat that the professor, where the children are staying to hide from the Blitz of London, and Peter's talking about Lucy, and I think Lucy has lost her mind because she says that there's a world beyond the wardrobe. And the professor uses logic. He says, well, what do you know of Lucy? Well, who would be more liable to lie, Lucy or Edmund? And he says, well, certainly Edmund, not Lucy. Lucy is pure in spirit, and Lucy is innocent and clear and vulnerable. She's exactly how we should be. So Lucy wouldn't lie. And so the professor basically says, then what makes you think there isn't a land beyond the wardrobe? Why don't these children learn logic? And so when I look at, the finger of God, and you see gold teeth and gold dust and, naturalism material, it can't be a miracle. I think you've got the most fragile worldview around, because one miracle, your entire world collapses. And, whether it was American charismatics or whether it was Haitians, you travel around the world enough and you begin to see this world is a very strange place. Yes. And I talk to friends of mine who are so obviously gifted by the fruit of the Spirit, and they're honest and they're humble and they're self-effacing and they're living for others. And they tell me a story about what God has done, much to their surprise, but they simply can't deny it because they're honest. They say, well, that can't happen. And it's like, how do you know what can and can't happen? Oh, tiny little center of the universe. Are you? And then we're to the end of the book of Job. Can you say how this whole thing was put together? And yet at the same time, so we deconstruct the sacrament, or we deconstruct, worship. And it makes me think, well, yeah, there's plenty of dissonance in my mind and plenty of questions I can't answer, but how deep down does God go? And, I watched the conversation that Joey and Tyler and Julian did. They posted it on the Randos United channel, which is kind of a sub channel of people who have talked to me, talking to each other. And I don't remember exactly what what Joey was making this metaphor from, but this kind of tower against tower. And this is what I've noticed in terms of God, that it's always more than, it's always beyond. And of course, this squares perfectly with Christian theology about, all of our ability to know God is always limited. But the more we get in, does God take the kinds of risks we say no good God should take? Yes, he does, because he's beyond that. Is he more generous than we can imagine? Yes, he is. Is he hold us to a layer of accountability that we think is outrageous and irresponsible? Yes, he does. I mean, it just keeps scaling up. And so
what is he not too? That's the question.
Exactly.
I think that's the thing too, that like my experiences in some really unhealthy facets of charismatic culture. I'll give you one fun story in particular. I had in my office at the time, and it was a very charismatic church, most ethnically diverse church, which is another strength again.
Yes.
Anyways, a wonderful church in so many regards. So I'm not speaking disparagingly of it. And I love the people that are still there. But I was in my office. I had these I forget if they were IKEA or World Market statues that were sitting on my desk, right? One of them was, they were a guy, and maybe some of you guys have this on your own desk. They were popular for a while. One guy playing a saxophone and another guy playing a guitar, and they don't really have faces. They're just black stone statues. And I came into my office one day and I had a note from the intercessory team on my statues that said, well, we were doing intercessory prayer around the church. We came into your office and saw these statues, and we're concerned if they came from a part of the world that practices witchcraft or anything. We've sensed that there's a Nephilim spirit on these statues. They came from World Market. They were probably assembled in Taiwan. I liked them because it just was something to brighten up my pretty Spartan looking office. When can we say that when someone is trying to explore the unmapped territory of God and the domain of spirit, and they're doing that with the intuitive side, when can we say, no, you're wrong? Simultaneously, I know it doesn't get necessarily easier when we're using geometry, but still, I was able to use geometry perhaps in that instance and go, guys, like they didn't come from some witch doctor, They were concerned, like, to tie it back to the Dwight Hopkins language, they were concerned that this aesthetic was actually a portal to demons in the spirit.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I was saying, no. I mean, it might be a portal to capitalism, cheap labor.
And some of those demons.
It could be that, but it's not a Nephilim spirit just because they're tall. And now I feel like I'm meeting my one time a podcast requirement of mentioning the Nephilim. It's kind of a running gag. I don't know why. They come up every time. Every time. So that's an example. And for me, I think the project, and even you just sharing that's helped me, is helping me in the process flesh out what I think I'm trying to work through, is be able to tell people, no, I don't think that is God. Because, and what is the criteria that we can evaluate that? Because this is the connection to the sacrament stuff for me, is I could never, some people did, somebody that would want to tell me, no, you can't experience the presence of God in musical worship. That's just your own endorphins, that's just your own hormonal experience of group singing. I think it can be both, so let me just say that. Somebody that tells me, no, you didn't experience God in that because the way that he's present is in this list of sacraments, I got to go, no, you're wrong. Because I've actually seen more spiritual transformation in my life when I would come out of a really, really long time of group worship, or even just privately listening to music, and something is changing in me. This aesthetic is giving me a window into what I think is the Spirit of God. And the way I'm evaluating whether it's the Spirit of God is it bearing fruits in my life? You talked about, a bit of revival history, and someone had come to, either it was John or Charles Wesley, someone concerned about the charismatic experiences that were happening at the revival meetings. And we have indications of like people falling out, what we might say are slain in the spirit, or people just in the middle of the meeting crying out and screaming, ah! Yeah. And they were really concerned by that stuff. And, I'm paraphrasing slightly. Someone came to either John or Charles Wesley about it. You're like, what do you make of that? He's like, oh, I know that guy stopped going to the bar and beating his wife every night after that. And I go, okay, is the means of grace a little bit more expansive than we thought? Is it just metanoia? So, you think of even David's tabernacle, which I had traveled around the country telling people, we need to do this. We need to have 24/7. And even we need to employ people so that people were really doing this. I was kind of doing this, raising support as if I was a missionary. There's a thing actually called intercessory missionaries. All right. So down at Kansas City and the International House of Prayer, I've got friends down there. They raise support so that they can pray round the clock. We were doing that because we thought what we need to have happen here is David's tent happen all across the world, and that's going to bring transformation. See what it did, David? Here's part of the story. I mean, and it's kind of crazy that, First Samuel or Second Samuel 16, he gets that thing set up. The very next chapter, the word of the Lord comes to David, and it's like, hey, through your descendants, the Messiah is going to come. And we always made that connection because it's like, well, see, God must be pretty impressed with that. The thing that's interesting about it is like David did that and said, yeah, we don't need to do Moses's thing anymore. Let's move the tabernacle. Let's move the Ark of the Covenant. And the question that runs through my mind, because I sit and I was talking with some Catholic people and Orthodox people about, I'm just trying to get at, is this really what you're saying when you say Christ is present in the bread and wine? Is that he's present because we think that he is, and it's changing our way of thinking? And they're saying, no, it's not that. And my question was like, okay, well, what if they're at Olive Garden having some breadsticks as they wait for their meal? Could they sit there at Olive Garden and go, man, Christ, you hold everything together. The very molecules that make up this breadstick are being sustained by your very will. I receive this with grace. I receive this with thanksgiving. Is he present there? And some might go, well, no, he's not in the same way that happens when it's in a church, right? A priest blesses it, or there's an invocation. Well, what happens if the invocation doesn't happen? Well, if the invocation doesn't happen, the transformation doesn't happen, right? So are we really saying that the means of grace is in the speech act that causes us to see a new way? I'm not landing anywhere on that.
Right.
I'm processing this with another pastor who I know won't have me burnt at the stake for bringing up that question. Is it a new way of seeing it? And if there's a thing that becomes obsolete and no longer produces that metanoia, if we have a practice, so I've gotten to the place now where I really truly feel there was a genuine musical worship movement that happened. It really started back in the Jesus People days, the Lonnie Frisbee days, the Chuck Smith Calvary Chapel, where they started realizing we need to communicate in the language of the people, right? It's the same principle behind why the New Testament is written in Koine Greek instead of High Greek.
Right.
We need to communicate why, because this will produce repentance. And then from that, we get people like Keith Green all the way down to your CCM in the 80s. And then in the 90s, this stuff starts happening with things like the Passion Movement. And, and now you talked about it, you might have the most high church that's thinking we need to add a contemporary service. Why do we need to do that? What they're saying is like, we need to copy the charismatic sacrament and bring that sacrament here. But now we've gotten to the point where, in my opinion, it's like now that's become an industry, a massive industry, right? And the primary way that I actually serve in our church is as a pastor overseeing worship and the arts. So I get this stuff inundated in my mailbox every day. Buy this, check out this massive industry. And I feel like Isaiah 1 going, I don't want your music. Like God's going, I don't want your music. I want metanoia. So, I've just been thinking about, well, what does it mean for us to actually be able to say God is present? It's affecting my thoughts and my values. It's changing my aesthetic and my labor. How can we also say to people, I don't think that's God? Because part of even what you were saying about the critique against progressive woke religions is that there's elements there that you say, this doesn't come from God. It's leading to this. So how do we sort through that? That's the $64,000 question right now.
I've been so I have my regular stream, and then I have my Sunday school stream, and my Sunday school is sort of a place where it's kind of an estuary between all the stuff I do during the week with, all these videos that I make and all these conversations that I have, and then the Bible, and then, a handful of folks at Living Stones who are mostly African-American ladies over 70. That's most of my Sunday school class. And some of these women have been, some of them grew up in Jim Crow South. But many of them have been in church all their lives, but in very different churches than mine. Some of them don't even come to my worship service. They just come for Sunday school, and then they go to their own black church after that. So it's a fascinating group. But, so I've been, I've had Owen Barfield and, original participation and then final participation and all of this going through. And I've for the last few weeks in that Sunday school class, I go through scripture often fairly slowly. I spent 75 weeks in the book of Revelation at one point, which how any Sunday school class could ever bear that, I have no idea, but these people do. They're
Calvin said, I'm not touching that book, but Paul Vanderklay said, come to Sunday school.
Well, it started because one guy named H.J. Hicks, who I baptized in his 70s, he worked a bunch of small jobs around, worked for auto dealers and stuff, washing cars and driving and things like that. His wife was coming to church here, but he had never been baptized. And when I first met him, he had like 4 copies of the Bible comparing things. He was always trying to fill things out. And I'd always ask at the end of a book, as I go through books serially, I'd say, what book should we study next? And HJ said, not Revelation. And I thought, we got to. And so we spent 75 weeks in it. It was actually about 35 weeks in Isaiah that almost killed some people. But anyway, so I've been in the Gospel of John in Jesus cleansing the temple, which is something that I've preached quite a bit on in the synoptics over the years, because Palm Sunday comes up every year, and it's like, there you go. But I've been in the Gospel of John, and so I've had Owen Barfield rolling around in my head. And so you have all of these issues that are very sacramental in nature going on in that moment, because so you can understand let's say the Vatican II Mass in English adaptation that the community is doing with being able to purchase animals and exchange money for the sake of this massive wealthy diaspora Jew population that wants to celebrate the Feast of Passover in Jerusalem. And so that function of exchanging money and purchasing animals for sacrifice is an important sacrifice given the entire history of what has happened. So you have synagogue worship going on, but the temple still remains, and you have that interchange. And so for the last 2 weeks, I've been going through that in Sunday school where Jesus drives them out, and it's like, well, what's going on with that? And then the Gospel of John mentions, quotes, zeal for his Father's house. And now zeal is a trigger word for violence. Phineas, if you read N.T. Wright's biography of the Apostle Paul, Wright nicely lays that out in that book about, zeal is sticking a spear through a Jewish boy and a Moabite girl in a tent in the middle of coitus. There you go. There's a word picture for you, baby. Right into the ground. That then becomes this action that defines the word. Now, when I ask my Sunday school about it, they use a psychological term. So we've got all of these back and forth over this participation line that Barfield notes, because let's say, and I use the example of, let's say the neighbor of the Jewish family going to the Passover, the neighbor who's a Gentile says, boy, those Jews, they really live well. Their families are really together. There's really something about that. So maybe I'll go down to their temple. He's a pagan after all. So, hey, go down to the temple and offer sacrifice and get some of that good family mojo coming my way. And so he says, well, I raise pigs, so I'm going to take a pig to the temple. It's like, oh no. No pig sacrifices at the temple. And he's like, well, why? Well, in a sense, it's sort of like if my water pump goes out in my car and I think, well, I just replaced the water pump in my dishwasher at home. That only costs $40. That mechanic's trying to cost me, make me spend 200 for my water pump for my Mazda. So I'll just take that water pump from home and give it to my mechanic. Say, here, use this one. And he'll say, oh no, you need a special water pump to work in that car. And so this whole question of, do you have communion at Olive Garden, and why is that different? And we're especially why is that different from in the church? And we're especially having that highlighted when, so a little story about the Orthodox before I ever heard of Peugeot or Peterson or anything, talking to a colleague of mine as a good friendship with an Orthodox priest near here. And the Orthodox priest, my friend was talking to him. He was planted a church during the Seeker movement. And the Orthodox priest said something like, well, we're not ready to do evangelism here. Well, why not? Well, we don't have our cathedrals and our monasteries built.
Yeah.
And it's like, and so this line that Barfield has of participation and the splitness and all of that, this is what we're dealing with. And that line is all over the Bible too, because as you said, the beginning of, in the prophets, when they say, hey, I want mercy, not sacrifice, or obedience, not sacrifices. And that gets translated into synagogue worship, where in a sense, the observance and the rehearsal of the Torah and the prayers and the songs are replacing the altar and the animal and the blood and the fire. And okay, so now what are the connections between these two things? And what is the connection between, kind of these mental acts of metanoia? So this week I'm preaching on, so you have Jairus and then the woman with the issue of blood, and then Jairus' daughter being brought back to life. You have all that put together in the Gospel of Mark. And so, Jesus gets delayed by the woman with the issue of blood, and that is the freakiest. The miracles, like Jordan Peterson says, the deeper you go into the Bible, there's no bottom to it, because the thought that this woman would, unbeknownst to the Son of Man, creep up on him and touch him, and he says, who touched me? I felt dunamis.
Yes.
First use of the word dunamis in the Gospel of Mark. I felt dunamis pass out of me, and it's like, what the heck is going on here? How does Jesus not know? Oh, he only acts like he doesn't know. Well, maybe, but that's not the way he acted.
No.
And how is dunamis somehow disconnected? This release of dunamis somehow disconnected from his consciousness. What's that about? And did she trigger it by? And he says, and he said, well, it was your faith.
Yeah, that's.
Oh, what the heck is that? But a mental thing. And then they get down to Jairus's house, and the mourners are there already. The ceremonial mourners are there, and they're already carrying on. And we're too late. And Jesus says, believe,
Yeah.
pistis.
Yeah.
And then of course, gets rid of the crowd, goes into a room, select disciples, mother and father, daughter, Tabitha, awake, and bang, and it's like, this world is strange. There's something really deep, and the whole Bible starts with the God Elohim speaks, and tohu avohu, let there be day, and light and darkness separate, and dry ground and seas separate, and this is all happening by speaking. So all of this stuff is in here, and the fact that we're groping and stumbling and fighting, it's perfectly expected, and that we don't know what's going on, that's absolutely what you should expect if you read the Bible. And for me, then, as a Calvinist, in a sense, come with John Calvin and say, yeah, he's spiritually present. Can I explain that further? I don't know if I ever will be able to. And so then also as a Calvinist, then I finally rest on, you know what? I'm finally saved by the mercy and grace of God. And that's very low resolution. And certainly I'll try to up the resolution if I can. But that's finally where I rest. It's in his grace. And so if he's using Orthodox and Catholics and Pentecostals and fundamentalists, and if all of these issues are being actually worked out by all of these different regions of the church. Okay, Lord, it's like my New Testament prof said when we were studying eschatology and we're looking at the exegetical value of the millennium. Is this a literal millennium or not? And so he said, because we're all amillennials at Calvin Seminary, and my New Testament prof says, if Jesus comes back and says, we're going to do a literal 1,000-year reign, go along with him. So we're very small creatures who can't see well and don't know much, and by God's grace, hopefully we learn and can contribute, but this drama is going on around us, and so I nothing that I have done in the last 2 years has made me any less a Christian, or in fact any less comfortable in the tradition that I was born into.
Yes.
So I don't know, maybe that's a good place to end. We're going on 2 hours here, which doesn't surprise me.
No.
Any last things you want to throw out there?
No, I think, we could do a multi-volume discography on this, because there are things. I don't want to start unpacking this stuff, but when you said dunamis, I'm like, I knew what dunamis was probably at 10 years old, even though I didn't know what the Beatitudes were in my tradition, because we talked about this stuff. And even when you were throwing out, well, what did God do when he brought reality out of, brought from he himself, his ultimate reality, was bringing about a reality that is external. I don't know if that's even the right phrase for it. What did he do? He spoke. Oh man, that's like in our house, it was like, this is why you have to watch your confession. This was prosperity gospel. And people always think about prosperity gospel, they think about cars and stuff, but where prosperity gospel began as part of the word of faith movement was you noticing that, like, how is it that this gal's faith drew this dunamis out of Christ? And there's this deep connection between the words that we spoke. What did God do? God spoke reality to being. What do you need to do? You need to speak reality into being. When I hear Jordan Peterson talk about the Logos, and he's not really getting it in the historic Christian sense, but he's talking about essentially the power of words. I'm getting triggered because I'm thinking about my Kenneth Copeland daily devotionals and what they were trying to get at too. And in our house, like, my mom will laugh at this if she listens to it. We weren't allowed to say, I'm sick. We just couldn't say that. That was a confession that would bring about a certain reality. You couldn't say I was sick. You could say, boy, I'm feeling as if, oh gosh, how would we have to put it? Like, I'm experiencing these symptoms now, or something like that. Or you'd have to word it as, boy, actually what we would say is, I'm healed. Like, you'd have to frame it that way. I remember the first time being as a kid at another Christian's house who didn't come from our stream, and he said to his dad, "Dad, I don't feel so good." And I was waiting. I was like, why didn't his dad correct him? He's going to bring about this reality by speaking it, so that's probably why part of my project. And I do think, like, we have to wrestle with this, because you're laughing, your listeners many of them are going to laugh and rightfully say, I don't think you saying I'm sick is going to change whether or not those physical symptoms come about in your life. But, right? How do we say that? How do we tell somebody? How do I work through with somebody that's grown up in that stream like I have? My wife, she went to Oral Roberts University, on a volleyball scholarship. Yep. The praying hands. She got kicked out of class one time. I'll wrap up with this. She got kicked out of class one time because they were teaching in one of her Bible classes. This is not a joke. That God was like a pop machine. Okay. You put your money in, right? You give, you tell God what you want, and what comes out is what you've put in, right? It's the seed faith. Yeah. You put in this, and there's this connection between faith and money. It's very convenient because it makes pastors really, really rich that are in those congregations. Yeah, get some airplanes. But I don't think it's all intentionally malevolent. I do think many people actually believe that. She got kicked out. She goes, well, what happens if I press the button for a Coke and I get a root beer instead? And they're like, get out of here, kicked her out of class. So we have this background that is really difficult for people to imagine. What I want to be able to work through is the ability to tell somebody, no, I don't think that's God. You're in unmapped territory here. You're finessing this thing. You're intuiting it. I've intuited many things wrong about God because I was actually experiencing anxiety. The voice of the Lord told me this: that might be your depression. I heard you say to somebody recently, like, well, when I interact with my wife, I'm using unmapped territory, right? This is the spirit of finesse. But also, when I listened to that, I was going, well, not entirely, because I think you could also do things like take some personality tests, right? Those are, people have critiques about those, but I found many of them to be very helpful, whether it's taking a Myers-Briggs test, maybe it's doing the Enneagram to help me understand some proclivities my wife has and I might have. And now it's mapped territory. And now I know, and we both know, and we've improved in our marriage because of that. So I think the project I'm working through, I don't want to speak for you, but I do think it's kind of what you're working through, is to be able to tell people, okay, you've shut off this domain as God doesn't exist, right? So Peterson's helped open that thing up because he's not anti-science, and he's bringing evolutionary psychology and people that realize that's mapped territory. It's true. It works. But this guy, he's also bringing in this unmapped territory. You're doing the same thing. And I think part of the motivation, pastorally, is to also be able to go and say to people, don't think that's God. But how do we say that?
Yeah. And that is, in some sense, I heard the beginning of Mary was talking with Karen, and Karen's the Meaning Code channel, which is another channel that is kind of, I talked to Mary and I talked to Karen. So the people that I've talked with are now talking together, and because I don't have enough room on my YouTube channel, they're doing it themselves.
Yeah.
And so Mary began that interview by talking. I mean, the question, C.S. Lewis says that pantheism is sort of basic religion. And right now, in terms of post-Christianity, a lot of people get excited about pantheism. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of, I think, a response to secularism. And they kind of go off New Agey in that direction. And the difficulty is not so much saying what's God. And this sounds dramatic in a secular world where we suspect that there is no God, or we believe that there is no God, and we suspect and fear that maybe there might be. Jordan Peterson says that. But the real question is figuring out, okay, what is not God?
Yes, exactly.
And how does that work?
And for that, I need a telescope and a microscope. If that makes sense. And I've been thinking a lot about that, because the transcendence of God, that sense of looking up, as he said to John, come up here, come up now. Yeah. Right? There's a coming up. There's Isaiah 6 in the Holy of Holies. What am I doing here? I'm a man with, take the coal and cleanse my lips.
Yep.
Right. And the angels are covering their eyes, even as they flap around with their other wings. There's a sense of, I think I heard you or somebody else say this, holy, holy, holy. That was a way of saying, right?
Yep.
For the ancient Hebrew people, a hole is deep, it's deep, deep, and it's the deepest of deep.
That's right.
It doesn't go beyond that, right? And so we want to be able to, with a telescope, look beyond. And I think maybe that's one of the things charismatics, more mystics do, is they go, the immanent frame, that's not all that there is. Here's some gold dust. You're like, what am I supposed to do that? Here's a feather that showed up. Here is people laughing in the spirit. I mean, there was even weird stuff that, even as deeply weird as I was, that I was able in our circles to go, that's not true. Things called toking the ghost. Have you heard of this?
No.
Toking the ghost. So maybe you remember some of the, we're going so long. I'm sorry, Paul.
No, it's okay. That's what YouTube is for.
Yep, that's what it's for, right? Toking the ghost. So there was this movement in charismatic circles called being drunk in the spirit. Maybe you've heard of that, where you'd see meetings of people. Rodney Howard-Browne was one of the pastors. And at his meetings, people would all of a sudden, it happened with Kenneth Hagin meetings too. Ken Hagin was another faith preacher. People would just start laughing. laughing uncontrollably. You guys can YouTube this. There's they're really funny to watch, actually. Entire auditoriums of people rolling around on the floor laughing. Okay. Somebody took it to the next level and go, why not just be, instead of drunk in the spirit, how about high in the spirit? And I'm not joking, Paul. There was a movement. It's still around today. It's called Toking the Ghost. And people will actually, like, I had people at meetings come up to me with like an imaginary doobie in their fingers going, do you want to take a hit of the Holy Spirit? And they would do it and be like, dude, he's so good. Tripping out. I'll give you another guy to look up. Oh, what's the guy's name? Scott Crowder. Okay. So I once went to a conference. I was invited to lead worship at this conference in Nebraska. The weekend before it might not be Scott. The last name is definitely Crowder. And he's actually like massively into theology too, which is interesting. The weekend before, they had the Scott Crowder in, who was into this toking the ghost thing. And like people were, what I was told was, yeah, last weekend we were toking the ghost, and old Bill here rode around like a horse around the sanctuary, and it was so fun. We were laughing and rolling around, and we were like, so how did I get to telling you that? You got to be able to say to somebody, that's not true. That's not good. The Spirit, how do we do that though? Because some of them, I remember one of these instances at another meeting. All I did was church for most of my life. It's quite, people say I should get out more. Another church meeting, a different church, a guy, like, we called it manifesting in the Spirit.
Right.
They started manifesting.
Right.
He was laughing hysterically, rolling on the floor. And it was like this really quiet prayer meeting. And I was in leadership of this prayer meeting that night. And I was going to go over and tell him, dude, you got to stop, go outside. You just can't. It's such a distraction right now. And I went over to the other guy that was a leader. It was his home church that it was happening at. He's like, just wait, just let it happen. And I was so frustrated. I followed up with him after. He's like, man, I feel like I should have stopped that. It was such a distraction. It was taking away from people to seeing and praying to Jesus. I felt like it might have been demonic. He's like, well, yeah, man, like the guy came back to church the next week. And you know what he told us? He came into this service high and drunk. He's been addicted to all of these things. He got hit with the Holy Spirit in that moment, and he has not touched a pill or a bottle since then. I was like, oh, I guess I'm glad I didn't stop it. But simultaneously, I go, all right, there's also weird, I don't know what to do about it. But you're right. There is a sense in which we need to say, that isn't God. That's a created thing. It's not the creator. It's not the one above all. It's not ultimate reality. We're deriving these images from some other spirit, and we have to like test the spirits. That is also a New Testament injunction, that we test the spirits. So I guess maybe part of the work we're doing is testing the spirits, right?
Yeah. It's a weird and wonderful world. And I had the same experience once. I made some disparaging comments about Jim and Tammy Baker, because how is it not easy to poke fun of those two and their entire story?
Right.
And then somebody comes up to me and says, my parents became Christians because of them.
Yep.
And and if it weren't for them and that crazy crying ministry on TV with the makeup flowing and all of the insanity, God uses it.
He does.
And so
doesn't mean it's the same thing as blessing it, though, too.
That's
that's
right.
What I've had to tell people. They come from these revival meetings, and I just saw, during that time, there was this revival when I was heavily in charismatic circles, a revival happening in Lakeland, Florida, with a guy named Todd Bentley. And in the middle of that, the guy was, and I don't like speaking negatively about people, I'm just using this as an example. Todd had an affair with his wife during the revival meetings, and it just came out. He went through some restoration process, jumped right back into the fray of ministry, and now there's just been reports of the last couple of weeks about him, propositioning male interns for homosexual acts and all sorts of other sexual deviance. And yet these crazy things were happening at this at this revival, and when that all came down, there was a lot of hurt people that had attended those, maybe even
Yep.
became followers of Jesus at those, maybe even
Yep.
experienced something miraculous, and they
Yeah.
go, was that all fake? And
Yeah.
my encouragement as I came out of that to people was like, God's just really frugal. Like he will use means that are very economical, right? But that doesn't mean it's a wholesale endorsement. So
I love that. I'm gonna rip that off.
please do. I rip plenty of your stuff, Paul. So
God's just very frugal. And that's the thing. And he's generous. I mean, it's both.
Yes, yes.
Oh,
yeah.
well, thank you so much,
Thank
Paul.
you, Paul. This is a blast. I hope we can stay in conversation.
Yeah, and I'll end the recording now, and we'll just keep. God bless you and your podcast, and I'll put the links down below.
Cool.
And
Awesome.
yeah, this was so good.
Thanks.
I so appreciate your story, because we automatically develop these low resolution pictures of each other, which are just low resolution. But
yes, right.
but just hearing your story, and well, now it's like if I have a question about someone in this whole side of the world,
yes,
it's
feel
like,
free to come to me.
I know who I can ask, because this dude knows people. He's
Oh,
been
gosh.
places. He's
Yes.
seen stuff.
And most people have no clue when they meet me now, or they listen to the podcast now. I mean, I've hinted and I've shared with other people on other podcasts, like some of my backstory, but it doesn't come up because these worlds usually don't go together, sadly, and that's, I think, my long-term hope. I'm in a really, it's a free church. It's part of the, evangelical free denomination, though we don't have we don't go, we're EFCA here. Probably half the congregation's more Calvinist, the other half Arminian, some quasi-charismatic, some maybe cessationist. People that have no idea that about me. So it is kind of fun. I don't tell these stories publicly often, so it'll be fun.
Thank you for sharing them, because I think actually amongst the people that listen to mine, there are some people that grew up with this, and so it's helpful to know that, well, there's other people in this whole conversation that know this world too.
Yeah, and a lot of people I know reach out to you about like psychedelics. That's one of the questions. I get that question a lot, and in person when I meet with people, especially guys in their 20s, they're asking about that. And so many times I hear these psychedelic trip stories, and I go, that sounds like charismania.
That's right.
And I've been working through that piece too. That's probably, so if you come across people, that's something I do. I want to meet. That's kind of unmapped theological territory. There's not a lot of writing or academic, interests in that, the use of psychedelics. So I know you get questions about that. If you get things that you're like, hey, you should read this, I'm really interested in that, because I struggle pastorally even to go, well, guys, I just think it's wrong. But they go, well, what if it produces this in someone's life? What's your theological reasons? I just go, and then sometimes I kind of feel like my parents, who are still kind of against alcohol consumption. And I go, well, I just sound like an old fuddy-duddy. I don't know why it's wrong, but I don't think you should do it. So,
well, I read, so James, Dr. James Frazee, he's in my meetup, and he and I had an early conversation about this. And then they had one book to read he teaches at a junior college. He proposed 12 rules for life, and the administration made that suggestion go away. Yeah. But they did read How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. And part of the redemptive value of secularism, and people might be surprised to hear me say that, but I mean, secularism can sort of become an attempt at a neutral space by which to look at certain issues. And so Michael Pollan's book I found very balanced and informative and educational. So he takes it from a secular point of view, whereas, some charismatics might say, okay, wild experience on a psychedelic, that must mean demonic. Well, maybe.
Yeah, right.
And so, but so we have no idea, but I would recommend that book.
I'll check it out. I did have a listener reach out to me who's actually like a pretty committed, like Patreon supporter too, and he's really, and his story he shared with me was that he he dabbled quite a bit. He's a younger guy, dabbled quite a bit with psychedelics, and he explained it to me. He's like, one of the ways I think of it is like bread. Some people are allergic to gluten, and they can consume bread and it produce bad things. Other people don't have that allergy. They can consume bread and it causes no problems. I was like, oh, okay, I can, I can see that being maybe a path, like a nuanced path forward instead of
Yeah.
just wholesale right or wrong. But anyways, thanks, Paul. I appreciate this. This has been a blast.
All right, Paul, take care.
When do you I'm sorry, real quick. When do you think, cause I don't want to necessarily post it before you, when do you usually, what's your turnaround time?
I'll post it this week. I try to
Okay.
post 6 days a week.
Gotcha.
And the rest
Okay.
the Lord, on the seventh day the Lord rested. The seventh day moves around for me, but I usually try to post about 6 times a week. So it'll come up.
I'll probably be reposting the following week after. So if you don't see me like reposting like
Oh,
on
no
my
problem.
platform, it's not like, oh, this went bad. It's just I try to give one conversation a week. They're already long enough. I don't know. I don't know how people
I
adjust
don't
all
know
this.
how people sometimes,
It's awesome.
I'm a little behind. I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm not surprised.
No, I dabble. I kind of like pick and choose, so
yeah.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Paul. Take care.
Yeah, take care.